if we don't learn how to communicate effectively and how to take care of ourselves in the process, we can end up, and very often do end up, creating the opposite outcomes of what we want. So, very often, we have this idea that, like, if I just make someone feel badly enough, they're going to stop doing what they're doing. Except that all of the literature points to the fact that when you try to make somebody feel badly, when you shame somebody, or even when you guilt somebody, because they're not the same. Guilt is how you feel about a behavior. Shame is how you feel about yourself, right? Many people in the world, automatically when they feel guilty, it flips into shame, but often when we try to make people feel badly about what they're doing, we end up increasing the chances that they're going to be resistant to our message, right? And so a big part of shaming, of communication, of advocacy communication, is in fact shaming. It's what we've all learned to do. It's what we've inherited. And it's counterproductive. It's not even unproductive, it's counterproductive. People, when they feel, studies have shown that when people feel even the threat of being shamed, they withdraw or defend or attack in self-defense, and they're less connected with their rationality, and they're less connected with their empathy. So they're less likely to feel like you're a safe person, because you're not, emotionally safe. They're less likely to listen to what you have to say, and they're more likely to dig into their own position. Now, part of this happens because we just haven't learned to do it differently, to communicate differently. Part of it is because, as you rightly pointed out, like, there's a lot of anger. People are really angry. Vegans are angry for good reason.
Welcome back to Plant Fueled. I'm your host, Callum Weir. Today we're peeling back the layers on the invisible belief system, one that shapes the way we think, feel and act, often without realising it. Most of us grow up thinking that the food we eat is simply just a personal choice, a matter of taste, tradition and culture. But what if that belief system wasn't as personal as we thought? What if the way we view certain foods, especially when it comes to eating animals, has been shaped by something much bigger? Something so deeply ingrained that we don't really ever stop to question it. And that's exactly what we're exploring today with Dr. Melanie Joy, a Harvard-educated psychologist, best-selling author, and one of the world's foremost experts on Carnism, the hidden ideology that conditions us to view some animals as food and others as simply just pets, wildlife, or something worth protecting. But this conversation isn't just about diet. It's about psychological mechanisms, social conditioning, and the way our belief systems shape our reality. We're going to be diving into the difference between personal choice and dietary preference, and why framing it as choice really overlooks the bigger picture. The psychological barriers that keep our belief systems in place, including cognitive dissonance, defense mechanisms, and the social norms that make change feel pretty uncomfortable. Why conversations about ethics and veganism are quite difficult, and how understanding Carnism can help us approach these discussions with more clarity and effectiveness. How to communicate with family, friends, and strangers in a way that fosters real dialogue instead of resistance, and how the oppression system operates, not just with food sources, but across society, and how dismantling these belief systems creates a ripple effect beyond our plates, and how making compassionate choices is more than just about animals. It's about becoming more grounded, more fulfilled, and at peace with ourselves. We're not just discussing what's wrong with the world, we're actually discussing how to build a better one, how to approach advocacy, activism, and difficult conversations in a way that's more sustainable, empowering, and deeply fulfilling. This episode is for everyone who has ever struggled with difficult conversation, felt overwhelmed by resistance to change, or wanting to get a better understanding of why people react the way they do when their belief systems are challenged. So if you've ever felt stuck in frustration, conflict, or exhaustion, this conversation will give you the tools to navigate these conversations with more confidence and ease. Now, before we dive in, if I could ask you one favour, if you could like, subscribe, give a star rating, whatever the platform you choose allows you to do. It helps this podcast more than you think. It allows me to keep bringing you the conversations and the guests that you want, keeping these important conversations going. It's the only thing I will ever ask of you guys. Nothing more. So back to the podcast. Here's Dr. Melanie Joy. Let's dive in. Peace and plants. Dr. Melanie Joy, welcome to Plant Fueled.
Oh, hi. Well, thanks for having me.
So over the last few years of recording this podcast, your name has come up a multitude of times from various different people all around different industries, people with that you've made such an impact on, whether that be, in person, online, or through various different outlets. Obviously, your work becoming increasingly more and more effective in allowing people to advocate, communicate, and, make more compassionate choices, and obviously change the way, people think in terms of ethics and like dietary preferences, and just creating a shift in the mindset that some people may have not ever thought was possible. So I really guess that pins the question of, for the listeners that don't know who you are, who is Dr. Melanie Joy?
Well, anyway, thank you for that. That's so really nice to hear. I never know, who's being reached by the work. So I appreciate that very much. So I am a psychologist. I am also an author. I'm the author of 8 books, actually. My best known book, which is what I know we'll be focusing primarily on today, is Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And that's on the psychology of eating animals. And it's the result of we'll talk about this a little bit later, but my doctoral dissertation in psychology. And that book is a bestseller. It's now in like 23 languages. So that's been, really incredible to see the reception for this around the world, the interest in this subject around the world. I have, as I said, 8 books. I wrote Beyond Beliefs, which I think we'll be talking about today too, which is a guide for improving communication, relationships, and relationships among vegans, non-vegans, and vegetarians. How to End Injustice Everywhere. And I have a new book coming out in a couple of months called A Half-Hearted Death Wish. And that's my first novel, actually. It's sort of the novelization of my life's work, essentially. And I'm the founding president of the NGO Beyond Carnism. And what we do is basically we work on raising awareness of carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals, this psychology of eating animals, essentially. And we also support people who are working to end and transform the system. So vegan advocates and, organizations, anybody who wants to learn how to, be a part of the solution. And if you're already a part of the solution, how you can have a more sustainable life as a vegan and be more effective in your advocacy as you communicate about these issues.
Many people who dedicate their lives to such meaningful causes can, often trace it back to like an earlier moment or experience that kind of planted that seed early on. Was there something in your life that kind of drew you to, I think, firstly, social psychology, but then I'm guessing as you understand and deepened your knowledge, there was obviously a particular realization that kind of reshaped how you saw your relationship or the world's relationship with the world and the beings around us?
Yeah, that's such a great question and really true. Like most of us, everybody, our mission grows out of our history, it grows from our history. So there were a lot of incidents in my life, and I'll share a couple, I think, that really will help listeners understand the journey that brought me to where I am today. Like many people, I grew up with a dog who I loved. I was always a person who cared about other animals. I would certainly never want to contribute to harm to animals, especially when that harm was like completely unnecessary and so intensive. And like most people in the world, I also grew up eating animals. And so for a lot of my life, I never thought about how strange it was that I could pet my dog with one hand, while I ate a pork chop with the other, a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as intelligent and sentient as my dog. All of that changed one day in 1989. I was 23 years old. It's a long time ago now. And I ate a contaminated hamburger. And I got extremely ill. I wound up on intravenous antibiotics in the hospital. And that incident basically turned me into a vegetarian. I became a vegetarian sort of by accident because I was just so disgusted by the last thing that I had eaten that made me so ill. And so then in the course of like learning to be vegetarian, what to eat, what to cook, and so on, I stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. I also met somebody who was a vegan, and I shortly became vegan. I became vegan shortly thereafter. And what I was learning, like, just shocked and horrified me. Like, I couldn't believe the extent of the harm and the suffering of non-human animals. I could, in one day, more farmed animals are slaughtered globally than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. And it was just unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. I couldn't believe the harm to the environment, public health issues, and so on, my own body. But what shocked me in some ways even more was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. They would always say something along the lines of like, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal. Or they'd call me a radical vegan hippie propagandist. And like, my head was spinning, because these were my friends and my family. They were like rational people, compassionate people. Many of them were quite politically progressive and really concerned with their impact on others in the world. They cared about animals, They were people like I had been when I was eating animals, right? So I became very curious about, how rational, caring people could just stop thinking and feeling when it came to this issue of eating animals. Like, why did the conversation just shut down? And that led me to eventually study psychology. I did my doctoral dissertation, my doctoral degree in psychology. I studied broadly the psychology of violence and nonviolence. At that time, there were no actual studies or full studies on the psychology of eating animals. So I studied the psychology of prejudice, the psychology of discrimination, the psychology of violence and nonviolence, very broadly. And then I narrowed the focus down for my doctoral dissertation to the psychology of eating animals. And that was what led me to identify what I came to call Carnism, which is the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. So, Carnism, basically the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system. But the only reason that we might eat pigs but not dogs is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. And that when eating animals is not a necessity, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. So that was really what was the catalyst. That ultimately became my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. That formed the foundation of the book. The book led to the founding of my organization, Beyond Carnism, and to a large degree, the work that I do today, which since then, when Why We Love Dogs came out, it was 2010, and the 10th anniversary edition was recently released. So since then I've expanded my focus, but that's really what led me to where I am today.
You mentioned carnism, and I think that is very much the one term that I see, and I know that I've probably put myself in more of a kind of like vegan bubble online, so I see those kind of the word come up more and more week by week as more people discover it. But I also don't think many people understand that it's a belief system more than it is a dietary preference, because I think people do see carnism and carnivore as the same,
right,
in some parts, and it's very much trying to educate people on the fact that it's not a dietary preference, it's a belief system.
Right, exactly. And it's really great that you raised that, right? And that's one of the main reasons I actually wanted to write about this and really raise awareness of carnism. We tend to assume that eating animals is just a matter of personal ethics, right? Because people don't realize that this, belief that eating animals is the right thing to do, it's normal, natural, and necessary, these beliefs that we've inherited, they didn't come out of nowhere. They are a part of this broader system. It's almost like, assuming that sexual harassment is just a matter of like, sort of a personal attitude when you don't recognize patriarchy, right? Sexism, this system that makes sexual harassment, highly likely, sometimes inevitable. You tend to think of sexual harassment as something that only happens, because of certain people who have a certain mindset. So let me just explain what kind of system carnism is, and that will help people maybe understand so it's not such an abstraction why eating animals is actually not really a matter of personal preference or personal choice. It seems that way, but when you dig deeper, it really isn't. So carnism, let me just give listeners like an example of carnism in action, right?
Go ahead.
So like, let's imagine that you're not a vegan, and you're sitting down, you bite into a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and says, that hamburger is not made from beef. It's actually made from golden retriever. Now, like, chances are what you had just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you just felt, therefore, as delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And rather than continuing to eat that hamburger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even take to the streets in protest. That is your authentic reaction to eating flesh, essentially. Carnism is a system that has distorted our perceptions so that we don't see what's right in front of us. And therefore, we don't feel the natural disgust and horror that we would feel at eating these animals. And our feelings drive our behaviors, so we continue to eat them. Carnism is not just any belief system, right? It's a special kind of belief system. It's a dominant system. That means that the belief system is so widespread that it's literally woven through the fabric of society. It shapes norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. So when people study nutrition, for example, they actually study carnistic nutrition. But because carnism is invisible, the bias is invisible. So a vegan might talk about nutrition and they're called biased. As soon as somebody challenges carnistic bias, right?
That's me every day.
Right. I can imagine. So carnism is it's a dominant system. All right. It's like embraced and maintained by all of our major social institutions from, family, religion, government, state, business, medicine, nutrition, and so on. Carnism is also a violent system. It's an oppressive system. It's literally organized around violence. And most people would never willingly contribute to this kind of completely unnecessary violence towards non-human animals. And yet most people do 3 times a day at the very least. And that is because systems like carnism they use a set of psychological defense mechanisms that distort our perceptions so that we act against our deeper values and our rationality without even realizing what we're doing. And when we're born into a system like carnism, we see the world through the lens of carnism. We internalize it. So these defense mechanisms, these psychological defense mechanisms that keep the system alive, which we can talk about in a minute, they get sort of like ingrained in us. People feel very defensive against anyone or anything that would help get them out of the carnistic box, right? And often they don't even realize why. Very often a vegan will just have to say I don't eat animals. And all of a sudden, boom, the defenses go up. And they're being told all the reasons that they're wrong about their own ideology by somebody who never even heard of veganism 5 minutes ago, right? It's incredible how irrational it often is. So this is why, when people are eating animals, this choice to eat animals is the result of a lifetime of very, very deep psychological conditioning that's completely outside their awareness, that shapes their attitudes and preferences and behaviors and feelings without them even realizing that's what's happening. And this is why it's so important for people to become not just aware of the reality of animal agriculture, but of carnism, the system that keeps them unaware and blocks them from the awareness that they need to actually make their food choices freely. Without awareness, there is no free choice.
Yeah, but this is one thing that I have found, especially over the last 5-6 years, is the fact that as soon as you mention anything to do with dietary preference, even if you actually aren't prizing into it at all, and people do just get their back up, there's denial, there's justification surrounding what they're doing, and there's that cognitive dissonance that's being forced into their mind for a second, and it's just it happens even when you're not prizing into it. It's I'm just mentioning, as you just said, I just don't eat animals, for instance, and there's just this somewhat anger that explodes in some people, which I find bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Well, understanding carnism can help that seem a lot less bizarre. So often, when you've stepped out of the system, right? When you've connected the dots and decided, okay, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. It all of a sudden, it just seems so obvious that eating animals is not only incredibly harmful, but just totally unnecessary and totally counter to the kind of world we all want to live in. Right. And it feels like it's so obvious to you, it should be obvious to others. And so often, vegans, for example, assume that, when they're talking to somebody about the issue, if only you knew the truth with a capital T, you'd never eat animals again. And then they get the person to watch Earthlings or, I don't know, Game Changers or whatever. And that person's at the McDonald's drive-thru the next day. And they're like, oh my God, what am I dealing with here? Or there's just this incredible pushback. And that's because, the facts don't sell the ideology. The facts are not enough, for many people, because this psychology that we have inherited, and I can talk about what these defenses look like a little bit, how they operate, so people, know what I'm talking about here. But this carnistic mentality, as I call it, is so deeply ingrained in us and so profoundly reinforced every single day. I mean, we learn to believe in, one defense of carnism is justification, right? And the way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. And there's this vast mythology surrounding eating animals, but all these myths fall under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary, right? And these same arguments have been used, to justify violent practices throughout human history, from male dominance to heterosexual supremacy, right? But we all learn to believe through our social institutions. We study history, we study medicine, we study nutrition, we study science, we study religion, or we just absorb religion, from our culture. We learn to believe that these are not myths, that these are facts, right? They're not facts. They're a set of widely held opinions that, when examined, are proven to be nothing more than just that. But we're just so indoctrinated over and over and over again. And systems like Carnism are structured to keep themselves alive. And, and the way they're structured is to be organized around these defense mechanisms and around this mythology, so that they become self-perpetuating. So, to your point, a lot of people are shocked. Like, what is it? Like, why is it that you're just so stuck in this mindset? But the mindset is something that has been cultivated. I mean, since the minute we're weaned, we're being fed the bodies of dead animals and told that this is like the right thing to do. This is the way things are supposed to be. It's just the way things are.
I find it strange because, like, we do struggle to see those belief systems because they are so integrated into society, and like where they're so ingrained into us. As you said, this doesn't have to be even food wise. This is religion. This is politics. You name it. Anything that has such a strong belief system around it, that's whenever it is going to get challenged, people do get defensive. And you see this in every different movement, no matter if it is veganism, whether it's political stance or anything. Yeah. Like, if your opinion or your how you think is perceived as wrong, there's just this, and I get it myself, like in other aspects of life, that there's that kind of whole, I will get defensive about something that I find to be right. However, it's, I could be completely wrong. And that happens with me still. So I'm guessing like it works in both ways as well. Like, or does it work from both ways, that we as vegans have created our own belief system? Like, obviously, morally, we know it's right. However, in comparison to people that think it's, wrong, have we then created a belief system ourselves?
It's a great question. And I think the issue is not so much as, whether you are, a part of a belief system or you're buying into a belief system or not. It's how you relate to your belief system that matters, right? And there are certain belief systems that really are structured, that are, when you deconstruct them, they are irrational at their core. They are based on a set of assumptions that are not rational and that are counter to the way that humans naturally operate and want to operate. So, for example, when we look at Carnism, we know studies have shown that we are hardwired to feel empathy for others. Most people cringe at the idea of animal suffering. They can't even look. We know that we're hardwired to feel empathy. We also know that we're hardwired to seek meaningful compassion. And if you poll people, if you talk to people, most people do not support unnecessary violence toward non-human animals. So supporting Carnism is completely contradictory to what people genuinely believe in the kind of world people would say they really want to live in. On top of this, Carnism is a system that is, it is based on psychological defense mechanisms, distortions. You look at a hamburger, you're not seeing a dead animal. That is a dead animal, right? But you're seeing something quite different because you're conditioned to see something quite different. Whereas when you look at veganism, which is sort of a reactive belief system, when you deconstruct the beliefs, they are in alignment with what the vast majority of people would say is their core value orientation. If you ask somebody what integrity looks like, when it comes to how we relate to other animals, most people would describe it in a way that's in alignment with veganism. It's not organized around a set of myths, and it's not organized around deceit. It's not organized around violence. It's not organized around distorting perceptions and blunting empathy. So they're very different types of belief systems. That said, the way we relate to our beliefs matters very much. There are plenty of vegans who, because vegans are people, and plenty of people who are very identified with their beliefs. They're very attached to their beliefs, and they feel that if they are asked to reflect on their beliefs or their opinions are disagreed with, they will become triggered and feel like it's an assault on themselves. That has less to do with the belief system itself and more to do with the degree to which a person has an ego identification with their belief system, right? If you're practicing veganism and you see your veganism as an expression of, your core values of compassion and justice, and, if somebody questions it, you can respond to them. If they're not being respectful to you, you can just disengage from the conversation. You don't take it personally. I know, easier said than done. That's quite different, than somebody who's getting up in arms and, and also has a position where, and also has placed themselves in a position of moral superiority around others who don't share their beliefs.
Let's say someone has just become a bit more aware of their own cognitive dissonance. They are something's broke through. They are kind of more aware of what they're doing. But how does one move past that? Because sometimes people become aware of that, and then they go to sleep, and the next day it's a brand new day. We've forgotten all about it. It's kind of like the people that you see go to, for instance, like KFC, and there's half a chicken head in their bucket, and they're like, "I'm never going to eat here again." Right. And then this obviously goes all over social media. People are like, "That's disgusting," but a week later, that'd still be in those places. So for the people that are having that cognitive dissonance broken, like, how do they then move forward to kind of pursue like a different way of living?
Right. And you're making a really good point, right? So cognitive dissonance, which is the internal discomfort that we feel when our values clash with our behaviors, and that this gets highlighted at certain times. Like your example, if, you see the head of an animal that you're about to eat, it might like remind you that this is an animal here that you're about to eat. And most people do not want to feel cognitive dissonance. It's uncomfortable, right? So they seek to mitigate it, to feel better. And one way that they can feel better is by changing their behaviors. Like, okay, I'm going to stop eating animals. Then my values and my behaviors are in alignment. Another way that they can feel better is they can say, well, I'm just going to change my values and say I'm a kind of sucky person who doesn't value compassion. And studies have shown that most people don't do that. A third way they can change or that they can mitigate or diminish their experience of cognitive dissonance is to change their beliefs about their behaviors. And this third option is what Carnism is organized around. It gives us the tools to not see what's right in front of us. So we don't think I'm eating an animal who was slaughtered unfairly and unnecessarily. Right. So Carnism, because not only does it provide us with these tools, but it continually tries to pull us back into this cocoon of unknowing. It's so saturated in the culture. You just turn on the television and people are celebrating. Carnistic culture is being celebrated and normalized everywhere we turn. So if you notice, that, wow, something's broken through your cognitive dissonance, you have this crack in the clouds and you can sort of see the clear sky. Don't just expect that that's going to last. Know that it probably won't. Know that you'll probably go back to sleep because changing attitudes and behaviors when you're going against the mainstream, it requires a commitment to staying awake and keeping yourself awake. And so this means actively seek out information. Right? Actively seek out information on a fairly regular basis. If you can, find an organization that is interesting to you. Like you might even want to try a vegan challenge, like Veganuary. They give you a challenge so you can, for 1 month, you can try to be vegan. Get involved where other people are. If you can find an online community that's compassionate and supportive, where you don't have to be fully vegan to be part of it, but that are engaged in this conversation and learning, that can be really, really helpful. Studies have shown, just having one other person who you're connected to, who's sharing in a belief or behavior can really reinforce your own.
I completely, I think without community, I think people do find it very hard, especially like when people are on this new journey and it is them on their own. Their whole family hasn't gone. It's just them and they're kind of going against the grain. So finding a community or finding, another person that kind of holds the same values and can kind of support you along that way is so beneficial. I find that with multiple people, it's the fact that sometimes they don't have that community or they don't have that person, or they're just trying to do it alone. And sometimes it does backfire because they do think they are very much on their own and there's no one around to support them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really hard. I mean, and if you think about it, like, the vegan who struggles because they're the only vegan in their family and they're like at Thanksgiving or something, or they're at some holiday dinner and it's just so hard for them. I often say, find one person in your family who can be your ally, just one person who you can talk to and say, these dinners are really hard for me. I feel like I'm not very well understood. The teasing is like really painful for me, whatever it may be. That one person, there's a big difference when it comes to like outliers with a different like orientation or different belief. There's a big difference between one person and two people. Once it's two people, you've got exponentially more power and you feel a lot less alone, and you've got somebody else who's giving voice to the part of you that you're trying to keep alive, and keep intact. For people who are interested, whether you're vegan or you're not vegan and you're looking for resources, Carnism.org is my organization's website. And we have a lot of short videos on there and just a lot of materials for helping build awareness around carnism and also around like being vegan in a dominant carnistic culture so that you can, take care of yourself and you can, hopefully find allies.
When it comes to conversations, as we just mentioned, like if you are around a dinner table with your family and unfortunately you don't have an ally, and then you're met with challenges, you're met with debates, there's this defensiveness between both parties. How do you start the better version of conversation without triggering these arguments? Because you want it to be beneficial for both sides. However, it doesn't always work that way. I know from my own experience kind of, because there's so much passion, especially to begin with. There's so much passion, there's so much emotion that you're like, I'm going to go straight in, and it's not always the most productive of conversations.
Right.
If anything, it ends in arguments. It's kind of like the same as when people play Monopoly. The table is being thrown up in the air, and it's
Well, the author Carol Adams, I'm sure a lot of people can unfortunately identify with what you describe in your experience. The author Carol Adams points out, and I think rightly, that the dinner table is not the place to be having a conversation about veganism. People are digging in to their carnistic products and are probably more defensive than usual. Even it is often the time people want to talk about it because food is the focus of conversation a lot. But I would always recommend tabling, no pun, that conversation to another time. If you're one vegan with lots of non-vegans sitting around a table eating animals who want you to suddenly be the token vegan and explain to them why you're vegan, and then you have to try to do that without triggering their defensiveness, which is kind of like built in them. That is tough. And I would recommend not having the conversation at that point in time. So in my book, Beyond Beliefs, I know how hard these conversations can be. And I have some scripts that people can just like photocopy and change a few words of, and like ways to talk about these issues with the people in your life at the right time. What I will say is a couple of things. One is that I believe, just on a more meta level, that everybody in the world, and especially those of us who have difficult communication situations that we find ourselves in often, which is what happens when you become vegan frequently, and who are trying to advocate for change. We need to build what I call relational literacy. This is the understanding of an ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And, one of the most important aspects of relational literacy is building effective communication skills. Communication is the primary way we relate. And, I often say this, I'm shocked that we have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use. And most of us don't get a single formal lesson in how to have healthy relationships and to communicate skillfully. And when you look at the problems that we're dealing with in our lives, and in the world, the big problems in the world, these are not problems that are caused by people who don't know how to do geometry. So when people, if you can commit to building your relational skills, even by 10%, 5%, that could be a total game changer for your life. When you know the principles, for example, of effective communication, you can talk about pretty much anything without arguing. And when you don't know them, you probably can't talk about anything without arguing. You might know people who are like, aligned, completely aligned in almost every way, but they still find a way to argue with each other. So that's on a more meta level. We have resources to help people with that. We have videos. I've written several books just on relationships. One of them is Beyond Beliefs. One of them is called Getting Relationships Right. That's for, just relationships in general. And we have a short video, like 7 minutes, I think. And it's called What to Say to Vegans. And this is a video for vegans to show the people in their lives and to say to them, this is what the world looks like through my eyes. And I always recommend this. So if you're, back to your question about like, what do you do when your family is like, doesn't get it, and they're not being nice to you as well. And that's a whole other piece of it. Once you have built your communication skills, you'll be able to identify disrespectful communication when it's happening, and skillfully respond to it. But this, what we really need to ask, many vegans get very frustrated because their family members are eating animals. And this is totally understandable. Like they feel like, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but like you become vegan and all of a sudden, like important connections in your life start to fall apart. It's like, I can't feel connected with you anymore. Like you were so close to me and I can't feel connected. How can I feel connected with somebody who's like, behaviors are so reprehensible to me?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely understand that.
Yes, it's pain. It's really, the loss of connection is so painful. And so many vegans start to get like, think understandably like, okay, well, if only you go vegan, then that connection will come back. And we want to turn the people around us vegan in part because we care about the animals and we want to stop, the animals from suffering, in part because we feel guilty if we can't turn the people around us vegan. Like, if I can't even reach my own family, what good am I for this cause, right? We feel this incredible pressure to save lives, and very often, our family members and the people who are closest to us, they're the hardest people to reach and sort of least likely to hear our message. And that's for a lot of reasons. And, one reason is that there are existing power struggles that, predate the veganism. Another reason is like some people are just not ready to be vegan yet. And that might be the people who birthed you. Like they're just not going to be there. What we can do, however, and I recommend this for all vegans, is to not say to the people in your life, go vegan, as much as you might want to do that. If you want to restore connection and you want to create a more harmonious relationship, you can ask them if you can share information with them. You can ask them to be an ally to you. And you can say to them, listen, I really want to share information about veganism with you, not to make you go vegan, but so you understand me, so you know what the world looks like through my eyes. Because if you don't understand this part of my life, you're probably going to offend me. And it's going to be really hard for us to have any kind of connection. And that's a reasonable request. So we made this 7-minute video and it's like what the world looks like through vegan eyes. And I can share if you want just like a couple of talking points from that, if you feel like it would be helpful as well. But I would recommend if you feel like there's anybody who's receptive in your circle to share this video with them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do feel very lucky that, weirdly enough, that my family very much are vegan now, and the friendship groups around me have been, and I don't know if I've had any part to play in that. I like to think I have. My mum, sister, my very close friends who were all meters at one point. The only one is still working on, my dad. But the majority of the friendship group is very much gone either plant predominant or vegan in themselves, and I feel like that isn't the norm for everybody, which I'm very grateful for. But it makes life so much easier. It does make life so much easier when everybody kind of sees eye to eye. And even if somebody's not completely all the way there, like them even taking a more plant predominant lifestyle, shows that there's an inkling there that they are looking after themselves, or they has some kind of like whether that be environmental or slightly ethical tendencies, it's showing that there is movement there over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And you make a good point. Like, your family, some people may not be totally vegan, but they're moving in that direction and they're allies, right? And so you ask somebody to be an ally to you. It's for many vegans, what they find is that like, they don't need the people in their life to be totally vegan. It definitely makes life easier. I get it. Like some of my family members went totally vegan and it's like easier for me, like just going out to eat or something. But it's what they do need is to feel connected and to feel witnessed. So if you think about like, if you have somebody in your life who's like, okay, I've watched the videos, I would not recommend that you ask somebody to sit down and consume earthlings or something, right? Because then you're asking them to like take in a lot of emotional violence that would, that could really backfire and cause all sorts of other problems. But there are things you can show them, and what many vegans find is that like when their family and friends are like, you know what, I get it. Like I'm not ready to do that yet myself. I don't know if I ever will be. But I really understand why you're vegan. I really admire that. Like, I really get what this means to you. It must be really hard to be living in this world that's so resistant, and so violent, and to see what you see all the time. And then to be a supporter of you. And people can have very deep connections across this ideological difference as long as they really feel like they're witnessed.
If we move away from family, activists, they have the best interests at heart. Whether that be animal, whether that be climate, fossil fuel, any sort of activist, there's a lot of emotion there, but they do have the best interests. And some people do struggle to get that message across because unlike, your family and friends where you do have a connection with these people, you are kind of going into the street and talking to people that don't know you for one, and you have no connection to, and it sometimes is just kind of a clash, especially if you have somebody that is vegan and somebody that's, let's say, a farmer on the street, and people see it as disruptive. People see it as they just want to cause arguments and kind of cause disruption in their day. And some activists do it perfectly. There are some activists that do it perfectly, whereas there's some that don't manage to get the message across, I guess. And is there ways that people can get the message across without seeming so defensive, so angry?
Yeah, definitely. And, we have a fairly new website that we've launched. It's infighting.org. And it's how to prevent and manage infighting among vegans and also other advocates as well, for advocates for other causes as well. And this website covers the principles of effective communication and, how, when you have a difference of opinion, how to communicate that difference to help open hearts and minds, rather than try to force people to change their minds. These same principles apply to how we talk to non-vegans, to our advocacy. And, very often you're right. Like there's vegans, we feel this urgency. Like we know that every second of the day, horrible, horrible suffering is happening. It's torture. There's no question. And, this caring, it's coming from a really good place. And we just feel so responsible and we want to just make it stop. And if we don't learn how to communicate effectively and how to take care of ourselves in the process, we can end up, and very often do end up, creating the opposite outcomes of what we want. So, very often, we have this idea that like, if I just make someone feel badly enough, they're going to stop doing what they're doing. Except that all of the literature points to the fact that when you try to make somebody feel badly, when you shame somebody, or even when you guilt somebody, these are not the same. Guilt is how you feel about a behavior. Shame is how you feel about yourself, right? Many people in the world automatically, when they feel guilty, it flips into shame, So, but often when we try to make people feel badly about what they're doing, we end up increasing the chances that they're going to be resistant to our message. Right. And so a big part of shaming, of communication, of advocacy communication is in fact shaming. It's what we've all learned to do. It's what we've inherited. And it's counterproductive. It's not even unproductive. It's counterproductive. People, when they feel, studies have shown that when people feel even the threat of being shamed, they withdraw or defend or attack in self-defense. And they're less connected with their rationality, and they're less connected with their empathy. So they're less likely to feel like you're a safe person because you're not, emotionally safe. They're less likely to listen to what you have to say, and they're more likely to dig into their own position. Now, part of this happens because we just haven't learned to do it differently, to communicate differently. Part of it is because, as you rightly pointed out, like there's a lot of anger. People are really angry. Vegans are angry for good reason. Anger is the emotional response to witnessing injustice, right? Anger is it's an important emotion, right? Your anger is a sign that your moral compass is working, and it gives you the energy and the impetus to step up and take action on your own or others' behalf. So it's a very important emotion. However, when we have not learned how to relate to our anger in a healthy, skillful way, then our anger becomes counterproductive rather than productive, right? So when we relate to our anger in a skillful way, we recognize it for what it is. It's nothing more and nothing less than an emotion. That's it. It's a data point. It's alerting us to the fact that there may be an injustice that we're witnessing. When we relate to our anger in an unhealthy way or an unskillful way, a couple of things are present. One is that we're blended or identified with it. We don't even recognize I'm having a feeling of anger. It's the difference between saying I feel angry or I'm feeling angry, or even better, a part of me is feeling angry and I am angry. In the last case, I and the anger are one. We're looking at the world through the eyes of our anger. And when you're blended with it, you're not really thinking rationally, or certainly not nearly as rationally as you could be. You're certainly not tuned into the experience of the other person with whom you're communicating. So you're much more likely to communicate in a way that's demeaning to them. When we relate to our anger in an unskillful way, it also has the charge of contempt. Contempt is a feeling, it's the opposite, the flip side of shame. It's a feeling of moral superiority, right? When you feel contempt for somebody, you're looking at them as being less worthy than you or anybody else, of being treated with compassion and, of being treated with respect. And as soon as you feel, research has shown that contempt is the number one feeling most likely to destroy any relationship. As soon as people feel contempt from you, they disconnect from you. It's a very disconnecting emotion. So learning how to relate to our anger is really, really important. And it can make a big difference in how we communicate.
I think, when it comes to anger, I think when I first started, or when I first kind of went down this avenue of, you're the angry vegan at first, you're trying to get your point across and you don't really have the right skill set to talk about these things. And I didn't at all. And over time, in the last 5-6 years, it's very much kind of, I've gone from very angry to very calm about things, and just kind of leading by example and being calm about things has worked better for me than me being like this and this is happening. And adding some humor to it as well. So I think as soon as humor's universal, and people love humor. So if I can also take the piss out of myself, knowing that it is going to get a reaction, we're both on the same ground at that point, and we both have a really kind of we can have a civilized discussion, because I'm like, hey, I know there's a ton of jokes about me. I know there's a ton of jokes about the movement. I'm going to get them out of the way first. Create the jokes on myself and just let the conversation go from there. And that's worked so much better than in the past when it was anger.
That's a really great point. And so for people who, like you, right, who can use humor, not everybody can because they're not as, comfortable with it, but it's a great way to really sort of disarm people, so to speak, and to demonstrate some humility, and you kind of put yourself on equal footing. And, humor really opens the heart and the mind simultaneously. It's great. And I love that. And it's also, I think a lot of times that we get very, quote unquote pushy in our veganism, in our advocacy, because we feel this investment in the outcome. Like many vegans, are very people who come into this movement, social change movements in general tend to be high on conscientiousness, and that's a personality trait where you're very concerned with doing the right thing and being a good person. And that's great. That's a great trait. And it's a really important trait. And it can, cause you to feel overly responsible and really hard on yourself, like overly responsible for the outcomes of things that are happening in the world that you might not have a lot of control over, like your advocacy, right? Or the result of your advocacy, I should say. So, for example, as a psychologist and, somebody who specializes in relationships, that's the other piece of my work, but of course it's very interconnected. People have very often will come to me and talk about the relationships and, ask me for advice or whatever, feedback, and I'll give it to them. And I'll say, okay, well, here's what I'm thinking. Plenty of times they don't act on it. They'll be, oh, great. Oh, yeah, that makes so much sense. And then they'll go back to their lives and, kind of continue with business as usual. It doesn't bother me at all because I'm not invested in the outcome. Like, they asked my advice. I shared my perspective. I'm not the expert on them or anybody else. I don't know what's going on inside of them. Hopefully what I said was helpful. And if it wasn't, it wasn't. And all I can do is just be honest in the moment. And I think this is the same kind of thing that we need to apply to our advocacy. When we're newer vegans, especially, we tend to feel like, oh my God, it's my responsibility to turn everybody around me vegan. And if I don't, I've somehow failed. Right? So you share information and then the person doesn't act on it or doesn't respond or whatever. And then you can start pushing harder and harder and harder because you feel so responsible and like somehow you're failing and letting the animals down, letting the movement down if you don't force change or bring about change. The author, Colleen Patrick Goudreau, says, make the goal of your advocacy to plant seeds. Nothing more. Just plant seeds. That's all you can do. And those seeds will grow when they're ready to grow. I mean, advocacy is not about opening hearts and minds. It's about, changing hearts and minds. It's about opening hearts and minds. And all we can do is create an environment in which our message is as likely as possible to be heard the way we intend it to be. Beyond that, we don't have control. Legislation forces people to change. That's great. I'm all for legislation. But legislation doesn't get passed unless enough people have been advocated to and they're already on board.
That's such a, I think that's something that I've kind of underestimated, is that obviously things don't really change until obviously you get a lot more people on board and, planting those seeds over and over and over again. And when they grow, they will grow, because I think we just assume sometimes that things will just grow as soon as you plant them. However, these things take time, and is it going to be a tomorrow thing? No. Is it going to be in a few years? Possibly. Is it going to be in 100 years? Who knows? We can never know. But those things that they are being planted. But I do think the media is a big driving factor in how people are kind of influenced these days, whether that be like the news, magazines, Google, Facebook, podcasts, independent media, legacy media. We're so influenced by what we see on TV sometimes that we can even question ourselves on whether we're doing the right thing, because you see something that's completely taken out of context and then portrayed on the front of a news article being like this and this is bad, like a vegan has died doing this, and it gets people thinking that maybe they are doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the media, just like, all institutions has historically played a role both in maintaining oppression and in ending oppression. It goes both ways. Institutions tend to go both ways. And so, the media normalizes carnism. It celebrates, it's like you turn on the news, just the news itself, on TV, and it's Thanksgiving and all they're talking about is the turkey, or the 4th of July barbecue or whatever. And there's a backlash, I think, now against veganism. I think veganism has, it's made enough strides. It's become, quote unquote, mainstream enough. It's not mainstream yet, but it's, made enough strides that there is a natural sort of resistance from not the whole culture, but parts of the dominant culture. And that's normal. That's what happens. I mean, that's what feminists have experienced. That's what people who are, fighting racism have experienced. Like, you make progress and then the culture starts to push back. It's like a chess game, social change is like a chess game. That's not, in my opinion, reason to be concerned that we're not doing our jobs right. In some ways, that's, a sign that we're being successful in many ways. And, some people in the media is changing in its coverage. So I literally just got back from 2 trips. One was to Finland and one was to Croatia. In both countries, I got substantial amount of national and international press coverage, like in the biggest magazines or newspapers there. That's incredible. That would not have happened 10 years ago. There's no way. I gave a talk at the Helsinki Book Fair, which is this big book fair. It was standing, hundreds and hundreds of people, standing room only. That would never have happened 10 years ago. So there really is a sign that, things are changing when many people in the media themselves are changing their attitudes and are really seeking out opportunities to raise awareness of veganism and animal exploitation and doing tremendous work. So it does go both ways. And I say this because a lot of vegans get very disheartened when they see the kinds of reports that you're talking about. And that's totally understandable. I think we just have to look at them in the broader context. And it's not as bad as it may seem.
Yeah, I think very, very much so that like a lot of these things are over exaggerated. They are cherry picked, and they like to find a certain title or kind of hook. And when there's a vegan involved, that's going to be the hook, because there's such a stigma towards us sometimes. But for the average person that is just starting that journey, and like obviously it can feel overwhelming, especially if people are at the the very, very start. It's emotional, there's rage. However, how can someone that is on that journey kind of cultivate some kind of happiness and inner peace within themselves in a world that doesn't really allow for that sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? Like, how is it that how can we stay happy? How can we stay hopeful in this world that feels so overwhelming, right? And that's the question the Buddha was asking and trying to answer, actually, and did. So humanity has been, life is suffering, and there's been suffering since the beginning of life on this planet. And people have been seeking to find ways to cope with that suffering. And this is where, building in a practice that can help you maintain a sense of equanimity, that can help you sort of like build mindfulness, essentially, right? Building an awareness practice to step out of this default way of operating and thinking that we have all learned to operate within, which is very, we would say ego-based and control-based, is so important. If we don't commit to the health of our own minds, if we don't commit to having healthy minds, we don't have, there's no way we're going to be able to keep our chins up in the face of what's going on. And even if the world weren't going to hell in a handbasket, which it certainly looks like it is in certain ways right now, it would still be hard to get through life because really hard things happen to people and to the people that we care about. Waking Up is an app. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Sam Harris's app. It's really great. I highly recommend it for building like basically resilience and like really, really building a mindfulness practice that's not just relaxation mindfulness, like, oh, I'm learning how to like reduce my, my stress levels or sleep better, but it's really about changing the whole way that you understand the meaning of being human on this planet and the whole way that you relate to your minute to minute life so that you can be more present in the moment, that you can be more clear in your own mind, and that you can have more internal equanimity and balance despite all of the sort of like stormy seas that are surrounding you. I would really recommend that. Waking Up is the app. And if you can try that for free. There's another app called The Way, which is great for meditating, but Waking Up has a lot of lectures on it and conversations and interviews. And it's basically teaching these core Buddhist principles that are at the foundation of many philosophical traditions, and really answering this core question: how can I move through the world as a human being in a way that is as skillful and balanced as possible, despite what's going on around me and also within me?
I think there's been definitely quite a few mindful practices that I've actually had to stick into, my life to actually kind of like navigate what's going on, because you can just, wake up and, watch TV if you want. And normally that's the news that people watch, and, it's setting you up for a bad day, because there's never anything good on there. It's always very negative, emotional things. And if that's what you're doing first thing when you wake up, setting you up for a bad day. And obviously, social media usage and, just being more mindful about the day and trying to, implement more mindful strategies to have somewhat more impactful days for yourself, whether that just be for, just purely self-care. At the moment, obviously, with social media, we are just showing the most provocative things that, really raise people's anger. And there has been a kind of like rise at the moment in ex-vegans and changing. And is there any kind of real rhyme or reason of what's going on there? Because obviously these people, I don't know if they went for ethical reasons. You're only ever seeing it for like, a 30-second reel, and you're not seeing the whole ins and outs of their lives. But for somebody that says they were vegan and now have gone back to the other extremes, it's not normally they've just gone back to eating meat. They've gone the other direction. It's completely carnivore. But there seems to be a big shift in that in the last, I'd say, 6 months to a year.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know if it's just that it's like more people are posting about it, versus more people who have gone back to eating animals. And if more people are becoming vegan in the first place, then we would see higher numbers of people who stop being vegan. So I wouldn't say it's a huge cause for concern. I would say that, I believe that any reason that people choose to go vegan is an ethical reason. Like if somebody decides, for example, if you've got somebody in your family who's got heart disease or who just wants to take care of their body and they decide to stop eating animals to do that, like practicing compassion to yourself as a being is ethical, So, and I think, or for the environment, that is an ethical choice. All of that said, studies do show, to my recollection, that people who choose to go become vegan because of health concerns are the ones who are more likely to stop being vegan. I do not find it terribly concerning. I think it's very normal. A lot of people experiment with a lot of different things in life. People will go off sugar and then they go back on sugar. People start exercising regularly and then they stop. People start try polyamory and then they decide they don't want that. They can't do it. So, and many people who do become vegan do that early in life. They're young. They're like college students, they're high school and college students, and they're in a phase in their life. They're experimenting and they're sort of trying to discover who they are. I think this can be very confounding for vegans who think, well, my God, if you connected the dots, once you connect those dots, your flesh is disgusting. Yeah. How do you go back? But it's just true, psychologically, people, what I call carnistic numbing, kind of pulling, the whatever mask over our eyes, that can happen even when you have connected the dots, I don't know. I remember seeing this expose on sweatshops years ago. So horrified, absolutely horrified. And it didn't take a very long time before I went out and bought a pair of sneakers that were made of, they were vegan, but they came from China. I did not feel good about it, but I did it. I felt like, at the time I didn't feel like I had a choice because I had to get shoes and I couldn't find anything else, but whatever. So we just, there are a lot of reasons that we swing sort of in our beliefs and our behaviors. What I do think is that sometimes people go from being full-on vegan to full-on non-vegan because of this perception that vegans have actually promoted, which is either you're 100% vegan or don't even bother. You're part of the vegan club or you're out. Yeah. And it's this very all or nothing mentality. And this was captured for me anyway, a few years ago when I was flying home I live in Germany, and I was flying back here to Berlin, and I was on a long flight from South Africa, Lufthansa, and I was sitting next to a pilot, a young guy who was a Lufthansa pilot coming back from vacation. He was flying for free. And he asked what I had been doing in South Africa. And I said, yeah, I was giving talks about my book, Why We Love Dogs. And he said, oh, you're vegan? I said, yeah. He said, oh, I used to be vegan. And I was like, oh. And now most vegans in that position would say like, oh, why did you stop being vegan? And I said, and I always recommend saying this, oh, well, what motivated you to become vegan in the first place? Like, that was my why. Why did you want to be vegan? And what did he tell me? He was like, well, I mean, my God, I read Peter Singer, I live in Berlin. It's like so vegan friendly. He's like, I mean, once you really understand veganism and you read Animal Liberation, there is absolutely no justification for eating. He was like, by the end of this conversation, he had so sold himself on veganism. I was like, okay. So then I asked him the next question and I said, well, what was it? What happened? Why did you stop being vegan? And he said, honestly, I'm a pilot and Lufthansa calls me last minute. I have to go on these long haul flights. And if I want a vegan meal, I've got to have it's got to be on board like 24 hours, in advance or whatever. He said, I was like bringing my carrot sticks with me. I just couldn't prepare properly. And then I would land places and I would get a salad, but the dressing was already mixed in and the dressing had dairy in it. And I was like, I said, well, how not vegan were you? He was like, I don't know, maybe 3 times a month I had to have something with dairy in it. So he went from being totally vegan and a hardcore believing in veganism, to totally not vegan, like just threw it out the window. And I said, oh, so why, what? He said, well, I just felt like I didn't want to be one of these people that always gets talked about. You call yourself vegan, but you're not really vegan. I figured, what's the point of even trying? And I really thought to myself, how many animals paid the price for that all or nothing mentality that's out there? He was worried about, he said, I didn't want to be called a hypocrite. So I said to him, well, why don't you I said, how vegan do you think you could be? He's like, I don't know, maybe 95, maybe 98%. And I said, why don't you just try to be as vegan as possible? And he was like, oh, I can do that? And I'm like, yes, I give you permission. You can do that. So he was so excited. The rest of the trip, he's like, this is what I'm going to eat. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be as vegan as possible. I use this example because I think it really captures this mentality that a lot of vegans put out there, with the best of intentions, but it ends up backfiring that you're part of the club, either you're vegan and you're part of the solution or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. And we really need to allow people and bring people into this, conversation and provide them with opportunities. And I always recommend advocating that people be as vegan as possible rather than just go vegan.
I completely agree with that. There's sometimes when for some people it is hard and it's sometimes not possible with jobs, as you just said. And hey, if you can be 98% vegan, that is better than not doing anything. Yeah, there's going to be a few hiccups, and vegans themselves sometimes eat things by accident. That doesn't mean you're any less vegan because the back of a packet has something in it that you didn't realize. That doesn't make you any less. You still are. It's a mistake, or it's just something that's happened to you.
Right. And it doesn't make a difference in the whole scheme of things, right? There are people who are vegan, this is their identification. They see themselves as vegan. They eat, largely vegan. But then when they travel or something, they're like, it's too hard, whatever, and they're not that restrictive. And it doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't bother them. And these are usually people who are very impact oriented. They're like, this is having no, the amount of impact this is having because I'm eating a cookie that's got dairy in it, when I'm on a trip to save animals, it's negligible. And so I think we really need to be very careful about how we frame this conversation. And frankly, really, we need to let impact be our guide. At the end of the day, we're doing this because we want to make, most of us anyway, are doing this because we want to reduce harm to animals. That is our goal. And so we need to keep our focus on our impact and how much harm reduction we're actually carrying out. We're actually able to actualize. Some of the people who reduce harm the most are people who are not even vegan, not even vegetarian. Like they might be journalists who like interview me and reach hundreds of thousands of people with a message who would never have heard it before, right? And you compare that with, say, a vegan who never eats animals in their life and perhaps communicates in a way that's not productive or counterproductive and turns people off to the message. Like, which one of those is actually sparing more animals? So we really need to be thinking, I think it's very important that we really think in impact. What is the impact of this effort going to have? There's a really, I forget the name of it, but there's Jack Hancock made Humane Hancock as his YouTube channel. He made a great video on how you can help farmed animals without being vegan, and really looked at the ways that people can have really significant contribution to this cause when they're not vegan, whether it's through donating. Some of the people who donate to my organization, which operates solely on donations, are not vegan, but they want to help end carnism. Like, that's incredible. I couldn't do what I do without them. So donating, using your influence in these various ways.
So I'm going to wind this up in a second. However, it's been an absolute pleasure, because I think you've definitely shaped and cultivated parts of definitely the world around us, which I'm grateful for. I know a lot of people that I've spoken to that you've changed the lives of are very grateful as well. But before we do wind this up, where can people find you? Because if people want to know more about you, find out what you're doing, if they want to watch your videos, if they want to read your books, there's a lot of books to choose from. Where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for what you're doing too. I mean, we're all doing our part, and, without the awareness raising and, having conversations like this and bringing them to a wide audience and like really helping people recognize like the health benefits of eating a plant-based diet and normalizing that and making that palatable and relatable for people, we would be way back, like we would not be anywhere near as far along as we are. So people can come to carnism.org. They can access, we have courses there if you're interested. One of them is called The Science of Effective Vegan Advocacy. So some of the points that we touched on here, like we really go into what works, what to say, how to communicate. So you can come to carnism.org for that. And all of my books are there. And my newest book, Half-Hearted Death Wish, which is my novel, will be, I don't know, I think it's going to be on my website, melaniejoy.org. It's my personal website.
Amazing. I will link all those in the show notes for the people that
want
to find out more about you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful for you.
Thank you. Back at you. It's been a pleasure.